You're watching Time of Readiness. I'm Daria Onyschenko, and I'm very glad to introduce our guest today, Frenk Lедвідж, a military analyst, former intelligence officer for the British Army. Welcome, Frenk.
Thank you, Daria. Nice to be with you.
I would like to introduce a bit to our audience who you are, tell something about your biography. I know that following 8 years as criminal barrister in your home city of Liverpool, you were working a decade in the Balkans throughout the whole former Soviet Union, doing different stuff in international human rights protection, criminal law reform, institution building at the highest levels of government. You developed particular expertise in missing persons, human trafficking, torture prevention. You're the author of a very famous book, Losing Small Wars. And you work for different outlets such as BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, etc. And also lately, you advised our government on policies for prisoners of war and missing persons.
That's all right.
One of the first questions I would like to ask you, if you were writing Losing Small Wars today, a book which tells about the failures of the British government during Iraq and Afghanistan wars, military strategy failures, would Ukraine become a part of your narrative for today? Or does the conflict war in Ukraine represent a completely different kind of war?
No, it doesn't. There's two aspects to this which may interest listeners and viewers. The first is that one of the reasons that Western powers cannot adequately assist Ukraine, or indeed develop their own defenses properly within any reasonable time, is that we spent 15 years or so on what I would call displacement activity, which is to say doing something in one place because we don't want to do it in another. In such wars as Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, and to a lesser extent in Kosovo and maybe Bosnia. And as a result of that, we neglected the ability and capability to be able to defend ourselves nearer home against more relevant enemies, both domestic, which you see today in England with an anti-Semitic attack by, I imagine, Islamists against our Jewish population, but more relevantly here against Russian and other threats to military threats to Western Europe. As a result of having our eyes directed towards these desert wars, which were utterly pointless and stupidly strategically conceived, we lost the ability to be credible in our defenses now. Now, you asked about whether, well, first of all, Ukraine has not lost the war. I don't think it's likely to do so. But the European powers, and indeed the United States, both under Biden and Trump, and certainly the European powers, all of them have in common one thing, and that is that there is no clear objective to what it is that they are aiming to achieve. So, how can I put it? Without an objective and a clear set of ends, ways and means, which is a strategy, you have no business in being involved in any military conflict. Ukraine has a clear strategy. Now, whether it's achievable or not is another matter. Certainly their political approach, I think, has been quite positive over the last couple of months. And clearly the Russians haven't responded. But concerning the commonalities, if there are any, between the wars we have and the Ukraine war, that is a lack of understanding of ends, ways and means, which is strategy. It seems to me to be quite honest and quite blunt that France, Britain, the UK, the US are quite willing to use Ukrainian soldiers to bleed Russia for as long as in the words of our Prime Minister Starmer, as long as it takes. And I would say to your listeners and viewers that that term, as long as it takes, has a very, very toxic history. since that term was used both in Iraq and Afghanistan to determine our involvement there. And in neither place did we stay as long as it took, because in neither place had we clarified what it was that was going to take. So there was no objective nor any adequate understanding of the means to get there. Now we have got ourselves involved in a war with Ukraine, or alongside Ukraine, without adequate capabilities or readiness to be able to prosecute that war effectively, or indeed to deter Russia from whatever it is that Russia will plan to destabilize us.
And how do you assess the effectiveness of Ukrainians' military strategy since the beginning of the invasion? And do you think that Europe has learned something from Ukraine during this time? Did Europe got the understanding that it should become military strong? Is it enough, or should it be more?
I suppose you'd have to look at different countries. Certainly the Baltic states and Poland, indeed from before the Ukraine war, was very aware of the risks it posed to it, and began its development 5 or 10 years ago. So Poland, I think, stands as an example of how to set up an effective deterrent force, and therefore an effective fighting force in the event that it should be needed. As I said to you, Britain, France, Germany, none of these countries, and Ukrainians have to understand, none of these countries have the capability to help Ukraine. It's just quite as simple as that, and won't possess that capability, even if all their very high-sounding undertakings are fulfilled for the next 5 or 10 years. I'll take as an example the United Kingdom. We can deploy to Europe about 1 brigade, right, which is not the same as a Ukrainian brigade, slightly bigger, probably with a little bit more armor, but that's it. 1 brigade. And we can sustain it for a few months. Were it to take extensive casualties, we may be able to replace some of those casualties, but that would be it. We can't deploy a division, let alone a corps of the size, CORPS in English, a corps of the size that, say, Khartia or Azov, Third Corps. Nothing like the size of that. That's the United Kingdom, supposedly one of the great powers of Europe. The same is true, by the way, of France. Germany cannot even spare a few thousand troops to send at the moment to Latvia. So there's much in the way of talk on the part of Western European countries, but very little capability to back that up with effective deterrent strength outside the borders of these countries, or indeed inside the borders. Such is the state of readiness in these countries.
But what you're talking about now corresponds a lot with the fear of people in Europe, which I witness all the time. The regular European, I lived many years between Germany and Ukraine, and I can speak for sure for German population. People are scared of the possible Russian invasion. They also think that Russia would not attack NATO if we don't provoke it. Yes, so this the changing of the thinking in the minds of people that the threat is real, that Russian can go further. How is it in United Kingdom? Do the people realize this threat? Is it present in the daily life of people? And how do you think are the media and press doing enough for informating people about this war?
Excellent question. Obviously, you can speak of Germany, and you have done so. As for the United Kingdom, no. The population of the United Kingdom has as defence as a priority would be about number 7 or number 8. There is very little awareness of the need for resilience or readiness on the part of the electorate, generally speaking. Our main concerns revolve around other national security issues, one of which I've mentioned, and it's very closely connected with immigration and lack of control of our borders and so forth. That would be very high up now and on the list of security concerns for the United Kingdom. But very low down, I think, is any sense of vulnerability. So, for example, we do not in this country have, and nor are we really planning to get, an air defense system which would deter Russian attack on even on our military bases, let alone our towns, by Russian submarine-launched cruise missiles or ballistic missiles. We have no ability to defend ourselves. And there's no plans to acquire, I rephrase, no realistic plans to acquire such capability. And the reason for that is that there is not at the moment the political will in the country to sustain that kind of expenditure that would be required. That plays on into Ukraine itself, because so the United Kingdom, whatever its talk, and it talks a lot, really cannot supply that much in the way of useful air defense capabilities. I mean, there are local, well, we can get into details if you like, but essentially it's nothing compared with what, say, the French or even the Italians have supplied, and they've run out now. So the answer is no. There is little sense of readiness, little sense of vulnerability. We have had over the last 3 months 2 national strategic reviews. One has been called the National Security Strategy, which is supposedly it does set out to improve these matters, notably in the field of homeland defense, national resilience, building not only awareness but some capability, much along the lines of what we had during the Cold War. We also had another very important paper called the Strategic Defense Review, which I think, in fairness to the Ministry of Defense, does set out a vision which will certainly improve our defensive capabilities over the next 5 years, assuming all the highfalutin, which is the high-sounding rhetoric, is answered by any kind of action, which of course will require a lot of money, which the United Kingdom, being essentially, or the government essentially functionally bankrupt, it will find it difficult to supply. But anyway, to summarize, the government is trying to raise awareness. It's certainly making a very good attempts, and it doesn't matter which government it is, it would be the same under any political colour, to strengthen Britain's defences, to make up for 25 years of neglect and dilapidation and decay. But that won't be repaired for 5 years, maybe 10 years. As for the average person in the street, there's no doubt at all. They have no clue of any of these things and have little interest. But there is beginning the kind of, we're looking baby steps here, as they say in America, for building some kind of systems and awareness. There are, 2 weeks ago, for example, we had on the telephones, on everybody's phone went off with an alarm sound, just as you have in Ukraine. It was a high-pitched alarm saying that, this is what you're going to hear in an emergency. And of course, that resulted in everybody being surprised and wondering why it was their phones were going off with such a loud noise. So they're starting to build some degree of awareness, but nobody would be able to tell, literally nobody, including me, would be able, and I'm reasonably aware, be able to tell you where the nearest air raid shelter is, or where the nearest target might be. I can, obviously I know that, but 95% of people do not. Or what to do in the event of an attack, or what mitigation, in other words, what preparation you need to make in the event that systems start to break down. 72 hours of food, torches, candles, food, water, this kind of thing. Very, very, very few people are aware of this kind of thing. As you know, in Germany, they're starting that. In Sweden, they're further on down the line. And in Finland, everybody knows exactly where they should be in the time of crisis and are ready for it. We are, if you look at Finland at a 9th level of, say, 85, we're at about 3.
That's not much enough. And what I witnessed last month is in Kiev that the Russians shoot more and more drones. They produce more and more drones. Like half a year ago, in the center of Kiev, you didn't have 300 of drones flying at once over your head. Through the night, and last months are really heavy, and it's getting worse and worse. Now Russians produce reactive drones, which are much faster, and our government, but also small companies, military companies, techs who produce drones, who should shoot down the Russian drones, they don't manage to stand in line with the tempo, with the speed of Russian production. Is it also like the overestimating of the abilities of Russian? Does it have also something to do like overconfidence? Actually, what you were writing about in your book, yes, about this failures of intelligence in overconfidence. So maybe it's the same about the Russian capabilities before and during the invasion now.
You mean on the part of Ukraine or part of Russia?
I mean that the Russian does have enough abilities now to destroy complete our energy structure, our infrastructure, and that it will keep producing drones too fast, which is a direct threat also further for Europe. Yeah.
Well, I think both Ukraine and Europe are realizing the importance of what is called in defense circles affordable mass. So, which Russia, and there's no doubt at all, with the exception of battlefield drones, Russia is ahead in terms of affordable mass. So affordable mass means that, as an example, the Geran or the other decoy drones they use, which are affordable, and you can produce them in large numbers for how much, 10 or 20 or $30,000. And if you are, I was talking to an Air Force colleague recently, and making the point that firing a $1 million Patriot missile at a $20,000 drone is not a good use of resources. But he said, it depends on what the target is, which is true. But it's very difficult to assess, of course, what target a Geran drone is aiming at for technical reasons. But I think what Ukraine does realize, no question at all, does realize now and is working towards very quickly, and I think they will catch up, is affordable anti-aircraft capability in terms of quantity as well as quality. And certainly Ukraine leads Europe in that. Whether it will exceed the production capabilities of Russia is a different matter. And as you yourself point out, the increasing capability and capacity of Russian assault drones both produce a very formidable challenge. And I think over the next few months, though, both the technology and the production capabilities will catch up, because that's the nature of the war so far. One side leapfrogs the other in whatever technical domain, and then the other catches up. And sometimes Ukraine is ahead, as you say. Sometimes Russia is. Right now, in terms of quantity, Russia has probably got the edge, but they won't retain that, I think, permanently.
As I said already before, you were advising our government on different questions in regard of our prisoners of war. And just a few days ago, a friend of mine got Václav Havel Prize for Human Rights. He was in Russian capture for more than 2 years, human rights activist and famous Ukrainian journalist. This prize was announced by European Council of Europe, and at the very same day, I think it was 29th of September, Russia withdrawn from the European Convention against prisoners' torture. Is it a kind of symbolism, or we see that the actions of Russia are getting more and more brutal, more aggressive? They're now bombing more and more civil civil population of Ukraine. Is it a sign maybe of weakness also of Russia, that the empire is going to fall? What do you think? Or
No,
are we
I don't think so.
provoking this escalation at the very end?
No, I don't think there's any provocation. I think this is the nature of what amounts to almost, it's not quite total war yet. I mean, to be fair, if we look at history, or even recent history, the British and Americans conducted a very similar bombing campaign against Serbia in 1999. I was part of that. I was actually on the ground in Serbia at the time. If we look at older history, we, the British and Germans, the Americans killed about 400,000 German civilians. That was not a mark of desperation. It was simply the way that we decided to do things. And we could talk about the morality of it all day. That's just what happened. With respect to the Russians, I think what's happening is they think that I disagree. I don't think they're right in this, but their strategists will be assessing that they believe that they can attack the will of the Ukrainian people through attacks of the kind we've been talking about. And I think you and I both know, and all your listeners and viewers know, that that's not the case. People will get tired of it, they'll get annoyed, they'll get angry, but they will not, the result will not be, or the output will not be, oh, well, we should surrender then, any more than it was for the German I'm not making an equivalence here. The German population certainly didn't believe in surrender because the British eliminated or destroyed viciously and brutally, and I'm not saying it was wrong, German cities. Similarly, the Japanese, with even more casualties, did not surrender when we killed 500,000 people until the nuclear bombs arrived. So no, this is a calculation by Russian strategists. The Russian strategists should understand their history, and history tells them that strategic bombing of this nature, aimed at undermining the will of a population, does not work, has never worked. There is no example of it working throughout the history of air warfare. What it does will simply steal the determination of the enemy and make them more determined to resist and carry on, I suspect.
And do you see now any, viable diplomatic ways, passes towards sustainable peace in Ukraine?
No, because there's no motivation from Europe to have that. I think President Trump I know this isn't going to be popular with many Ukrainians, but I don't know, but it doesn't matter. I'll say it anyway. And certainly not popular with Brits. I think President Trump was frankly the only hope for a diplomatic settlement, however ill-formed and ill-informed he was and remains. I think there was the shape of a settlement in mid-August, largely or mostly, in fairness, I think because the Ukrainian government was willing to be very realistic about where they were. I was very impressed, I must say, when I spoke to senior Ukrainian government officials and their realism with regards to whatever settlement might have been on the table. But of course, unfortunately, that realism wasn't matched by any will on the part of President Putin to stop this his assault on the country. So there is no diplomatic initiative now. My own view is that, it doesn't matter what my view is. I'll say it anyway. War will do what war does. War doesn't care what you think or what I think. But anyway, we can still talk about it. The purpose of Russia is to grind the Ukrainian army down and to a point where it can no longer resist. The Ukrainian response, which is entirely sensible, it's outlined by General Zaluzhny only this week in an article, was to try and offset a lack of numbers with a real effort in increasing a technical advantage on the battlefield. And Ukraine is moving towards that situation. From what I can see, I've not been on the front lines and I'm very unlikely to go, but it seems that Ukraine is getting there. It may not be there yet. My concern about the front lines, for what it's worth, which isn't worth much, is the huge casualties that Ukraine is taking. And the question is, how long can that be sustained? I've always felt and said in public that the Ukrainian army will not break, but there will come a point where that they really are faced with a severe problem of manpower. That's just the reality of it.
Yeah, mobilization is a problem, but I still think that we have a capability to keep for long, and we still have people who we can mobilize. But this is a good question in regard of United Kingdom. What is the image of military in the United Kingdom? How the people treat the soldiers? What programs exist for veterans? Is there something that Ukraine should learn from Great Britain? And what is also the attitude to the Ukrainian soldiers who now partly take rehabilitation in UK?
Well, the answer to the first part is soldiers have always had in our society a very high status. They are extremely popular. If you are in uniform, people will defer to you in a certain way. They appreciate service, just like in the United States. Very similar, actually. We're slightly less vocal about it than the Americans. So, for example, in the United States, I've spoken to Americans, and when I was in the military, British military, and they would a bit perhaps. In fact, I went on exercise and training to the United States, and people would say, "Thank you for your service." Well, I'm not serving the United States, but it's very nice to be appreciated in that way. We don't do that here, but people do in their way have the same attitude. Now, whether that translates into care for wounded and injured veterans is a very different matter. One thing we found was that state provision was not sufficient. So we've developed a system, a network of very capable charities and non-governmental organizations who filled the gap that the state couldn't. We have a couple of the most famous charities, one called Help for Heroes, which raised nearly £1 billion over a period of, I think, nearly 10 years, and did provide really good care for those soldiers who were assisted by it. But now, of course, with our stupid wars, the fact that they were stupid didn't impact on people's regard for soldiers, by the way. The one is a strategic comment, the other one is a patriotic one. People are very patriotic here, and they do support their soldiers, whatever war they're fighting. However, those wars have stopped now. So a lot of veterans, including very many of my friends who are damaged by this war, have been forgotten about. And the problem that Ukraine faces, and I know there are people, of course, such as yourselves working on this, going forward, is to prepare for the huge numbers of injured and psychologically damaged soldiers, as well as the reintegration of other combatants back into society. And I think that'll be the biggest single problem of your country once the war, God willing, ends. We have not faced that problem in the same way or at anything like that scale. So just to put figures on it, in Afghanistan, we had about 10,000, give or take, injured soldiers, some of them 2,500 or so quite seriously injured, and 500 killed. Now, you know that's a week's worth of casualties for Ukraine. And maybe we have several tens of thousands of people with psychiatric injuries. We can
have
barely
much
deal
more
with those. Yeah, of course. Yeah. And I think, there's history can teach us some things, and the way that things to do and not to do. But in terms of scale, I think you're looking at the kind of damage that was inflicted by the First World War, almost exactly in terms of numbers, inflicted on us. A million casualties, several million injured. I'm talking about by the end of the war, several million, perhaps a million, well, whatever, hundreds of thousands of people with severe psychiatric injuries. And the other thing, Daria, and this is something I've been interested in for a long time, and I know that this is a major issue in Ukraine. It's going to get much bigger, is the issue of missing soldiers. Not the ones who are prisoners of war and who are mistreated in Russian jails. That's one thing, and recovering and rehabilitating those will be a huge task in itself. But the many thousands of soldiers who are still on the battlefield, as it were, and finding and recovering them and bringing them back to their families was a huge problem in other previous wars. Or for us, less so in the Soviet Union, which we could talk about, but where they simply didn't care. obviously the relatives cared, the state didn't, but for us we did care about missing soldiers and trying to find those soldiers or their bodies, and recovering those, or commemorating properly their service and sacrifice. That would be a big task for you. And of course there are people already dealing with that, some amazing people in Ukraine dealing with that issue, but it's going to be a big problem as well. So you don't only have these terrible consequences of combat, psychological and physical, to deal with, and also social, to a lesser extent political at the moment, but also the question of the missing, let's be honest, presumed dead. So just to put figures on it, probably about half of our casualties in the First World War, we had 900,000 killed. Just less than half of those, 1/3 of those, were missing. We never found their bodies. And we had to find ways of commemorating them properly, which took a good decade, and recovering, to the extent we could, their remains, returning it to their families. I have experience, I'll just finish now, I don't want to finish this topic now, I don't want to talk about it, unless you want to talk more, but about this. But my experience of this was in the Balkans, and the problem with, let me put it bluntly, if you have a brother or a son who's killed, you find their body, you have somewhere to go. But if you have someone who's missing, then they die every day, because you'll never know if really, you'll grasp at every hope, and it's torture every day. And that's why this is going to be a really big problem. I think the government, which is cognizant of this, but it has so much else to concern itself with, I think it's going to be a big issue, and a big political issue as well.
I think since the scale of this war is really comparable with the First World War, it's so huge that it's not only the question for organization to take care of it, but it's a question that the whole society should be morally ready for these challenges. And this is a big question, how to organize society, how to motivate society, how to make society ready for these challenges of war, which no one of us expected.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't, just to go back to the UK on this and our readiness, I was talking to a soldier yesterday, it touches on what you just said, but we have no idea about the effects, just say, of one attack by Russia on one of our bases. They don't know, I probably shouldn't be saying too much here, but that the planning is, let's say, at a very early stage, but for dealing with attacks on say, a military base. But dealing with attacks on a military base is one thing, but then what happens when supply chains start breaking down, which they haven't in Ukraine yet, and they won't. That's that societal resilience in Ukraine, where supply chains and food supply did not really break down for a couple of weeks, maybe very early on, and then it was put together again. I'm not sure we have that level of resilience here, and no one is preparing for that. That I'm absolutely certain. For us, you've already gone through that process.
How much time do we have in Europe to get ready? What do you think?
Probably as long as whatever time the Ukrainian army can resist until some kind of peace deal is arrived at. I think that's about it. Then I personally don't believe the Russians are going to invade Estonia or attack Poland or whatever. I think what we are going to get, though, we are going to get cyber attacks, hybrid attacks. We're going to get constant destabilization. We may get proxy terrorism. We already, I think, see the destabilizing effects of forced, probably of, I would say forced, but encouraged immigration, this kind of thing. Certainly Poland has had that. I don't see Russian soldiers coming over the border, certainly not into the UK, but we're going to see a lot of trouble. And right now, I think their eyes are firmly on Ukraine, but once their eyes start turning elsewhere, that will change.
We have
So-
just a few minutes left, but maybe as the last question now, when we see these drones flying over Baltic countries, over Moldova and Romania, when you say you don't think they will invade UK, I also don't think so, but they will maybe do try attack the neighbor countries. What do you think about this?
I think that would be a very bad mistake were they to do that, because they would be defeated, I think, by NATO. The way that NATO is configured to fight is slightly different from the way the Ukrainian was. It's based around air power, which is something I know a little bit about. And I think our air power would overwhelm Russia's in much the same way as the Israeli Air Force overwhelmed its enemies. They draw on our expertise and we draw on theirs. I think the dynamics would be different, but I do not hope to find out whether I'm right or wrong. But I do think that Russian planners are aware of the overwhelming superiority that NATO has now. I will qualify that. I say NATO. NATO with the US. NATO without the US is a very different matter. And there I have no confidence.
And how do you estimate now the reaction on this drone story? Is it correct to do nothing and just to...
What do you mean, the drones? Drones over airports or the ones that went
drones
into Poland?
over airports, over different European cities, drones in Poland. Actually, no reaction coming from...
Well, they can't be attributed. This is the problem. And no one is quite sure where they came from. We had the same problem last year. And to be fair, I think at that time, when they were attributed, there were a lot of hoaxes and a lot of people jumping on jumping on bandwagons. And by that, I mean, one person saying it's the Russians, and then somebody saying, well, I think, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go out to Gatwick Airport and fly my own drone, and perhaps they'll think it's the Russians. Who knows?
But it reminds me of the Crimea 2014. No one knew where the green people come from. Yeah.
I mean, I think this is all if it is the Russians, then it's a clear example of grey zone or hybrid or whatever you want to call it, whatever term you want to put in it, destabilizing let's say subkinetic warfare. It doesn't rise to the level where Article 5 is engaged or there's a need for retaliation, but it is highly irritating and very costly. But the danger for the Russians, of course, is that if it is them and they go on doing this, that there will start to be may start to develop within, certainly, let's say, the British population. People get very hacked off with this and may start to think, well, perhaps we should spend a lot more time and energy on our defense. That's the danger of Russia. If they carry on this kind of provocation, that's what they'll provoke rather than anything else. And we're moving along that road now, that people are starting to become aware, but they haven't crossed that threshold where anybody is really willing to take steps to make a huge change in the way we deal with things. If we cross that threshold, then there'll be major changes.
We're unfortunately out of time, but it was really an honor for me talking to you. Thank you so much, and yes, it was my pleasure.
Okay, well,
I wish you a good evening.
And you, my dear, all the best.
Bye bye.
Bye bye to you.